Welcome back, everyone, to the next set of talks in this first session. We have with us Aubrey here, and she will be talking about jungle crow behavior and natural history, a causal gradient of human disturbance.
Thank you so much. So my name is Aubrey Alamshah. I just finished a PhD at Binghamton University studying jungle crows. And so I'll be presenting a portion of that thesis here to you today. So let's get started. Let's talk about jungle crows to begin with. These guys are one of about 40 species of crows that exist in the world, and these ones live all across kind of southern and East Asia. As you can see there, they live all across India, Japan, Southeast Asia, into the Philippines and those islands as well, which means that they live across a really wide variety of different habitats and also different human disturbances. So these guys exist in some of the most densely populated cities in the world, as well as some of the least densely populated areas. So these crows can live their whole lives in a huge city or pretty much never see a human. And so what I was interested in is looking at how do they adapt behaviorally to all of these vast different types of environments. Jungle crows, like most crows, they're generalists. They can eat a whole lot of different things. They can live in a whole lot of different places. And they tend to be very social. So they roost communally, and they also tend to hang out in groups. So what do we currently know about jungle crows? So we know that they interact differently with different species of crows. So in different parts of the world, they'll be interacting with different crow species. So for example, in India, they interact with house crows, which are famously a very city-oriented and human-oriented species. And so in those areas of the world, they tend to be more reclusive. They tend to try and stay away from humans. They tend to try and live in more forested areas, whereas in Japan, which is kind of the only other area where these guys have been studied, they tend to exist next to carrion crows. And in those areas, they've found that jungle crows tend to be more city birds. They tend to exist in habitats where there are lots of people and to eat mostly human leftovers, types of food, things like that. But those two areas are two of kind of the only areas that we have actually studied jungle crows. And they exist across this wide area all across Asia. And in Southeast Asia specifically, there are no other species of crows to interact with. So it's really important that we kind of understand how do they behave in this area where there's no other crows to kind of influence their behavior. So that's what I was looking into, is jungle crows in this specific area of the world, how they behave and how they interact with different types of habitats and different levels of human disturbance. So those are my two big questions, basically. I want to know, how do jungle crows behave differently in different habitat types? And how do jungle crows behave differently in response to different types of human disturbance? So that's a more small scale type of thing where there are just people around, or there are dogs or vehicles, short-term things like that. And so in order to answer a question like that, we need to get one population that spans over a gradient of different habitats and also human disturbances. And that's where the Scarrat Biosphere Reserve comes in. This is where I did all of my research. It's in northeast Thailand, in Nakhon Ratchasima province. It is a really unique and interesting biosphere reserve. It exists in the dry dipterocarp forest, along with the dry evergreen forest. So you've got two different forest types. It also has three different protection zones. So you have a core zone, in which basically nothing's allowed to happen except for scientific research. And then you have kind of transition zones where they allow for more and more kind of human activities to occur. So at the edge of this biosphere reserve, you actually have people living, working, you have agriculture and roads and things like that. So it creates a really good atmosphere to study different levels of human disturbance and different habitats. There's 3 main seasons. It's pretty seasonal in this area as well. You get hot season, which is hot and dry. You get wet season, which is primarily a lot of rain. And you get dry season, which is even drier, slightly less hot. There have also been a lot of changes occurring in this area. So another reason why it's really important to get a baseline of how animals are behaving in this part of the world is that it's changing very rapidly. So initially there was a lot of rice farming in this area of Thailand. It's since switched to cassava, which is more resistant to heat and drought. Another unique thing about this habitat is that it is very hot and dry and it tends to burn every year. Previously, they used to just let these fires occur, but in recent years, they have become larger fires. They have gotten a little bit out of control. They can go for just miles and miles and get really, really big and dangerous. So they've actually started having to do prescribed burns as the area continues to get hotter and drier. There have also been a lot of human-induced changes. There's been a lot of development. The area of Thailand is growing, increasing in population, increasing in infrastructure, and also in agriculture. So there's been an increased presence of things like cattle, pigs, and other livestock. So all of this, I wanted to see how the crows are reacting to all of these different changes in this area. And so to do that, we created 8 transects, 4 of which were inside the protected forest zone and 4 of which were outside in the agricultural areas. So these are all of my transects in relation to the biosphere reserve. That green area is the protected area. And what I did, pretty classic, is I walked each transect. Every transect got walked once a week. They were taken on in random order. And I would just walk down the transect, look for crows, and take down how many crows, where they were, what their interactions were, and what behaviors they were doing. I couldn't count every single behavior the crow was doing, so we created an ethogram of behaviors we were interested in, and this is a little part of that ethogram. You can get this whole ethogram online, and I have posted that in the Discord if you'd like to check it out. But essentially, we categorized all of these behaviors into ones we were interested in. We did foraging and exploration behaviors, we did space use behaviors, we did vocal signaling, and then other interesting behaviors that crow people just generally like to look at when it comes to corvids. So we created this ethogram, we picked out specific behaviors we were interested in and saw how those changed in different areas in response to different human disturbances. So what were our results? Well, as far as where the crows were and how many of them there were, we found that there were more crows in the agriculture. We also found that they tended to exist in larger groups in the agriculture. So you were less likely to find crows in the forest. And when you did find them, they were usually in groups between 1 and 3, as opposed to in the agriculture where they tended to hang out in groups larger than that, all the way up to about 60 crows in one area. Also, all of our observed nest sites and roost sites existed in the agriculture. Now, we only did find 2 nest sites, so this isn't incredibly significant. But it does say something that the only nests we were able to find were in the agriculture. So either they're nesting pretty exclusively in the agriculture, or nests are easier to find in the agriculture. And we'll get into that in just a second. But essentially, they're doing a lot of things in the agricultural areas, even though they have this protected forest zone that they could be living in. And so why might that be? Well, there are a lot of different reasons a crow might want to live in a more human-dominated area, right? They have delicious human treats that crows can get into. On the top left, you can see that this crow has found a little cake that's inside a tricky clamshell container, but he's getting into it. Crows are very, very good at using humans to find food. And so they'll use human waste. They'll also use human farming practices. So that middle GIF is showing something I was frequently seeing crows do, which was following tractors and plows as they plowed the fields. And as you can see, those plows, they kind of just dig up the earth and they annihilate any small creatures that they come in contact with, and the crows would follow these tractors around and pick up any of the dead creatures that they would find behind the tractors. Another reason they might be living in the agriculture is it's a lot more open. The forest areas are more dense. It's harder to see predators, particularly terrestrial predators. So things like macaques, monitor lizards, and snakes frequently predate nests and would eat a crow. And so they're all sleeping, they're all roosting in this eucalyptus plantation. And you can see eucalyptus tends to make the soil really difficult for other plants to live in. So you end up with this really open area underneath. And so if you're a crow and you're concerned about a snake or a macaque coming in and eating you in the night, this actually would be a really good area to sleep in. But there's also some potential risks of living in the agriculture, right? And so these could be potential traps that a crow would fall into living out here. It's easier to avoid terrestrial predators, but aerial predators are still exist in the agriculture. We saw frequent attacks by rufous-winged buzzards and black-shouldered kites. The crows didn't like having them around, as you can see in the top slide there. They also get nest parasitized by Asian cools, which are related to cuckoos. They do the same thing. They will lay their eggs in crow nests, and often they lay them earlier so that that baby is going to fledge before the other crow babies. And so in one of our nests, we had an Asian cool parasitize the nest. And so if it's easier to see the nests, if I was able to find the nests, it's probably easier for Asian cools to find them as well. There's also human disturbance, obviously. You have a lot of agriculture going on, potentially disturbing nesting areas, and crows who are trying to find food and exist out there. So potential issues with living out in the agriculture, but the crows seem to deal with it just fine. What we found was that calling, so just all crow noises, tended to increase in the forest. This could be for multiple different reasons. It could be that it is harder to get sound farther in the forest, so they need to call more frequently. It could be that because we found a lower density of crows in the forest, they could be more spread apart, or it could just be lack of visibility. We're not sure, but they do tend to call more when in the forest than they do in the agriculture. However, we saw a decrease in calling in the presence of humans, dogs, and vehicles. So this could be a potential reaction to a threat. This could be an increased vigilance. They want to see what's going on. We're not sure, but basically all of these human disturbance factors ended up in a reduced level of calling. So that was interesting. In the presence of dogs specifically, we saw a decrease in most of the foraging and exploration behaviors. Obviously, the crows see dogs as a threat. You can see in these two GIFs here, these crows are chasing off this dog. They don't like him around. Those two had young fledglings around as well, so they particularly wanted that dog gone. So the lowering of exploration and foraging behaviors could be potentially due to the increased risk that they perceive when dogs are around. But number of humans didn't have the same effect. It actually had a much smaller impact on the behavior type and the behavior frequency of crows. This could potentially be because humans are not just a threat. Humans can also, for crows anyway, be a source of food. They can be a potential indicator of something interesting going on. And so the behaviors that we did see an increase in were things like scanning, wing-tail flicking, which I have examples of those. The top GIF is wing-tail flicking. The bottom one is scanning. Those are usually understood to be kind of vigilance behaviors. And so we think that there might be an increase in attention when there are humans around, but not necessarily being perceived as a threat. Vehicles, interestingly, had the opposite effect as humans and dogs, in which case most exploration and foraging behaviors actually increased in the presence of vehicles. But when you take into account most of the rural roads in Thailand, in this area specifically, tend to be very rocky, lumpy, rural. Cars can't go very quickly, but they do run over small animals, and they create these situations where crows might be able to use that for foraging activities. And so we think this might be the reason for the increase in foraging and exploration activities when in the presence of vehicles. And so, just to wrap things up, basically, we looked at all of these behaviors. We looked at them over time. There was a level of seasonality to this. So, all of the reproductive behaviors all tend to kick off right around March and April time, which is incidentally the time when things start burning. And so, this means that we potentially want to look out for in the future. Uh, where this burn occurs, where the fires happen, and when, and if that changes, that could potentially influence the crow's behavior and when they're starting to do these reproductive behaviors, and when they are able to have offspring and raise them safely. So this is something to watch out for as in the future things get hotter and drier. They may start depending more on human water sources and human food sources because of the increased burn and the increased heat and the increased drought. But this is all things that might happen in the future. What we have now is we've created this baseline. We know what these crows are kind of doing in Southeast Asia, which we didn't before, and we can compare it not only to other jungle crows in places like India and Japan, but to other species of crows, and to look at how they adapt to different habitats and different levels of human disturbance in different areas. And we can kind of use that to see how they'll adapt to changes in the future. And with that, these are all the people I would like to thank. I would also like to thank all of you for listening in on my talk. And I can take any questions.
Thank you. It was a fascinating talk. I think we have already a question, and then I'll keep an eye on the chat. So the first question is from David: How is climate change affecting the behavior of crows? Are they finding fewer jungle habitats and moving more to urban areas?
Yes, so that does seem to be the case. What they're doing is we are finding them more frequently in agricultural areas and human disturbed areas. Which bodes well for crows, such as those in Thailand, which tend to like agricultural areas, or those in Japan that tend to like human-dominated areas. That bodes slightly less well for crows in places like India, where the house crows seem to kind of have dominance over the human-influenced landscapes, and the jungle crows tend to depend more on the natural landscapes. So I think how they react to climate change is going to depend a lot on what part of the world they live in and how they've adapted already.
We have a few comments. We have Emil and Natasha, who both say great talk and really cool research.
Oh, thank you.
We have a question from Kathleen, who's also part of the association. She asks, she says great talk, and she asks, it's really interesting that they seem to be in larger groups in agricultural locations. Do you think there could be social learning of some behaviors like following tractors?
Absolutely. I think that's something that has been observed in other species of crows. And there's even kind of this social learning kind of theory that they all go back to the roost site and kind of will share information, and then potentially maybe follow crows who have found a food source or found maybe a new unique way of getting a food source. And so that is kind of how that might spread throughout the different crow communities, essentially. And so we definitely think that might be something that's occurring and would be something very cool to continue to study in the future.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Emil asks, do you think the density of the forest restricted your ability to detect crows for the space use part of the project?
Oh, definitely. So we did take that into account when looking at behavior number and overall species abundance. We did try to take into account the increased difficulty in spotting crows in the forest. Thankfully, they tend to be quite noisy, and they do tend to make more noise in the forest, so that helped us out a lot. But yeah, no, absolutely, we did take that into account, that it was harder to spot them in the forest than it was in the agriculture.
I think that's all the time we have. So I see there are some more questions in the YouTube chat. So if you have questions, you can ask them to Abhi on Discord. Um, and yeah, I would like to thank you so much for your great talk. And I'll let you leave the room now as we move
Yes.
on.